Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here and to try to stimulate people's interest in this marvelous man. I have to confess to a piece of borrowing. A friend of mine, a lady called Cheryl Mishak, a Canadian, has written this wonderful biography of Frank Ramsey recently. And I was invited to review it, and so I've read it quite carefully. I strongly recommend it to anybody who's got an interest in the life of the mind, or Bloomsbury, or Cambridge, or psychoanalysis, or a great many things. So it's a wonderful book. For myself, I'd of course known about Frank Ramsey. Any philosopher growing up in Cambridge, as I did, is going to know the name, and we've probably read some of his papers and are aware of some of his abilities and some of his successes in philosophy. So he's a name known to specialists, but he's not a name, I think, known as well as he should be to a general public. I mean, if you compare him to, say, Bertrand Russell or Wittgenstein, both of those very great men were on either side of him. Russell was considerably older, Wittgenstein older too, but in a sense comes downwind of Ramsey in a way I'll try and explain. So what's it all about? Well, Ramsey was born in February 1903, and he died in January 1930. So if you work that out, it turns out he died and he's still 26 years old. And I think that's worth remembering, 26. It's very, very young. And he was part of the sort of Cambridge aristocracy. His father was a mathematics don, and his mother was a social sort of activist, a left-wing progressive woman. They were part of what you might call a Cambridge aristocracy at the time. If you want to read more about that, something like Gwen Raverat's book, wonderful book of Cambridge in the early years of the 20th century, would give you some sort of sense of the background. This was the golden years of the Don. It was long before I came along when the golden years were over. But Ramsey had obviously a very good upbringing. He was marked out as a genius, and the word is not used lightly, especially in that kind of context, from quite early years. He got a scholarship to Winchester, and he specialized in mathematics, but on the way he picked up German, very good German, as we'll see. And he went in due course on a scholarship to Trinity College, Cambridge, which was then and is now the haven of great mathematicians in Britain. And he graduated in due course in 1922. In 1924. He made an immediate mark as an undergraduate. He came to the attention of John Maynard Keynes, came to the attention of Bertrand Russell. He came to the attention of C.K. Ogden. Ogden was then the publisher of a series, and Ogden was anxious to obtain Wittgenstein's Tractatus. Wittgenstein was, in a sense then, as later, the sort of presiding enfant terrible stroke genius of Cambridge, and had disappeared from Cambridge. He was only there from 1911 to 1914, disappeared in the First World War, where he fought on the Austrian side. He was Austrian. Wittgenstein, of course, is well known to many people. He was a charismatic figure. He was immensely rich. His family owned the steel industry of the Austro-Habsburg Empire. He's recorded as having told somebody just casually that in his father's house there were 12 grand pianos. His mother was very musical. People like Mahler and Brahms sort of frequented the house. So Wittgenstein's upbringing was enormously privileged. Ramsey's wasn't. He was the child of a dom and the social activist mother. But he impressed himself from the very early age on everybody who knew him. He won all kinds of prizes at Winchester. He read mathematics at Trinity College, and in 1922, when he was still a teenager, Ogden asked him to translate Wittgenstein's Tractatus. Wittgenstein had written this book called the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus during the First World War. Wittgenstein was extraordinarily brave during the First World War. He could easily have got killed. He was frontline, a spotter for the fall of artillery. But during the First World War, he'd written this remarkable book called the Tractatus. It was very difficult to understand. It remains extremely difficult to understand. And there's lots of commentary on what he meant and what the principles behind it were and so on. But Ramsey was, as a teenager and an undergraduate, regarded as almost the only person in England who had a sufficient regard, a sufficient knowledge of philosophy and a sufficient ability in German to translate the thing into English. So he did the first translation of the Tractatus for a series that C.K. Ogden was the publisher of. At the same time, still a teenager, still an undergraduate, remember, Ramsey read a very remarkable book by John Maynard Keynes. Now, of course, Keynes is famous as an economist, but Keynes also, like many people in Cambridge, had several strings to his bow, and one of them was philosophy. And Keynes wrote a very, very interesting book. It's still very worth reading, A Theory of Probability. And Ramsey wrote in 1922, still 19 years old, for one of the Cambridge sort of intellectual magazines, a criticism of Keynes's theory of probability, which was actually devastating. It was so devastating that it upset Keynes, who didn't have a low opinion of his own abilities, to think that he, Keynes, had really a very poor grasp of philosophy. I mean, to think of a teenage undergraduate doing that is quite extraordinary. Nevertheless, when Ramsey graduated a couple of years later, Keynes scooped him up. Keynes is a great tribute to Keynes's generosity, to his lack of sort of Trumpian narcissism, that he recognized not only the power of Ramsey's criticism, but he completely put aside any personal pique or spite or vendetta he might have felt, and scooped up Ramsey as soon as he graduated for a fellowship at King's College, Cambridge, which was where Keynes himself went. It's a piece of baby snatching, because Ramsey was a natural denizen of Trinity, where all the mathematicians were, and where he'd done his undergraduate education and so on. But Keynes took him for King's in 1924. And they remained very firm friends and colleagues, as we shall see. So here we've got this young genius, this wunderkind, who's impressing all the knobs in Cambridge. what then happens? Well, the world of Russell and Wittgenstein, it's not easy to understand exactly what they were doing in philosophy if you haven't buried your head in it. But crudely, the late 19th century, under the influence of people called Peirce, an Italian mathematician, Gottlob Frege, a German, they started to become very worried about the foundations of mathematics. And this had become an obsession in intellectual circles. And in 1902 in Cambridge, Russell had published a book, The Principles of Mathematics, which was a kind of precursor to Russell's great book in 1912, the Principia Mathematica, which he'd published with Alfred North Whitehead. And these were systems designed to show that mathematics was basically just an elaboration of logic. If you could lay down a number of axioms, then somehow out of them you could prove the whole of mathematics. And the axioms wouldn't be specifically mathematical. They'd be about things like truth, falsity, identity, and existence. If you had axioms concerning how the idea that there is something which is something works, and there's something such that no more than one of it is something, then eventually you could generate the whole of mathematics. There's a wonderful project, it's now called logicism, and Russell pursued it with up until the 1920s, more rigor than anybody else. Partly it was an elaboration of a program that had been laid down by the great German mathematician David Hilbert, Hilbert's program. And this was in a sense to formalize the whole of mathematics. So ideally, if you could have a kind of proof procedure, what mathematicians call an algorithm, after an Arabic mathematician of more than a millennium ago, an algorithm, a mechanical procedure, you could crank out the true mathematical results, and you could also crank out a proof that the false mathematical results were false. This would have been a complete, decidable procedure for mathematics. And it was the pursuit of this program that grabbed the mathematical and logical intellects of Cambridge. And Russell pursued it more vigorously and in a way rigorously than anybody else. But Russell had discovered problems in the foundations of mathematics. I'll answer questions on this, but I shan't go into it now because it would distract us. It would be another lecture. Okay, so Ramsey came along and he graduated in 1924 when he was 21, very natural age to graduate. Keynes immediately got him a fellowship at King's College to teach mathematics. And he devoted his PhD years, or the years of research that he then did, to refining and extending Russell's own system of logic, Russell's own attempt to get the foundations of mathematics right. And for a year or two, this was important to him. But in a way, he always had another string to his bow. He had the formal ability and the mathematical ability to cope with Russell's logic, which isn't trivial. Well, it's trivial by some logical standards nowadays, but it was a big thing to master, especially in those days. And at the same time, he'd been introduced to the work of the great American pragmatist, I'll try and explain that term in a minute, C.S. Peirce, Charles Sanders Peirce. Charles Sanders Peirce was a a kind of, what's the word, a maverick, apparent by all accounts an extremely difficult man. He never held an academic post. He was at least half a scientist, and he worked for a long time for the American Geological Survey. But during these times, he wrote in the then intellectual magazines, which no longer exist, work about scientific method, about the nature of philosophy, the nature of psychology. And these were a great influence on a number of American intellectuals, probably most famously William James, the brother of Henry James, the novelist, and a chap called John Dewey, who was eventually enormously influential in educational circles and democratic liberal circles. But Peirce himself was a bit of an enigma. He was extremely smart. But as I say, a very difficult man, very uncongenial. He never had an academic post. He was in later life in considerable penury. But his writings were collected partly in sort of slightly strange ways, which Cheryl Mishak in her biography explains, but eventually came to be published in England under the title Chance, Love and Logic, rather good title actually. They were writings on probability, on scientific method, on psychology, hence the love, and on logic. And Ramsey was given a copy of these in 1923, then that's when he's just 20, and when he's still about to graduate, he's still an undergraduate. And they made a huge influence. They made a huge impact on him. So there's no question that from then on, his philosophy was running in a riverbed which had been forged by Peirce. And that's a story which Cheryl Mishak tells very well in her book, because she's a great fan of Charles Sanders Peirce. And this gave him a sort of angle on the work of the logicians and mathematicians that were then dominant at Cambridge, thinking mainly of Russell and Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein's Tractatus was a very austere work. It professed to give the logic of language, not just the logic of our language or the logic of French or the logic of German, but the logic of any language which was capable of representing facts in the world had to have a certain structure, according to the Tractatus. And Wittgenstein worked this out in some detail. Ramsey came at it a different way. If you come at language from the slant that Peirce offers you, you're not so interested in the logical structure or the mathematical structure or how the thing can be written down as a calculus. You're interested in how people use language. This is sometimes encapsulated in philosophical jargon as the difference between semantics, which was what Wittgenstein was doing, and the difference and pragmatics, which was what Peirce offered. Pragmatics is more about the use of language, the reason we have language, the evolution of language nowadays. And the perspective this gave Ramsey was one of one which turned out to be considerably critical of Wittgenstein. Now in Cambridge, to be critical of Wittgenstein was to be a kind of Philistine or heretic. Wittgenstein was God. Wittgenstein, having written the Tractatus, said that he'd finished all the problems of philosophy. There's nothing left to understand. Ramsey thought there was. He thought that the Tractatus left out too much. It was too austere. It left out the self. It left out our place in the world. It left out us as language users. It behaved as though a language was, as it were, a written set of signs, and the only job of the logician was to coordinate those signs with bits of the world. Now, Wittgenstein developed that program in great detail and with some skill, I mean, considerable skill. But he recognized that he couldn't show that language pictured the world, pictured the facts in the world, if those facts included things like the self, the will, ethics, so much that belongs to human life. So what Wittgenstein did was consign that to a kind of higher nonsense. It was the mystical. It was the bit that matters to us, but which couldn't be, in a sense, incorporated into this very rigorous, rather iron view of what language was. And so the famous last sentence of the Tractatus was, warum man nicht sprechen kann, darüber muss man schweigen. Whereof we cannot speak, thereon we must be silent. Now, Wittgenstein thought we were silent about it, but it somehow infused our mystical imaginings, our religions, our ethics, our hopes, our nature as human beings. Ramsey's roughshod reply to this was, if we can't speak about it, we can't speak about it, and we can't whistle it either. So, in other words, he completely departed from Wittgenstein's very austere conception of language and insisted on putting human beings back into the center stage. Now, that's the kind of thing that philosophers do. We read a text, we take something from it, we then start to puzzle about it, we dissent, we ask further questions, try and tease out what's adequate and what's not adequate. So to that extent, this isn't surprising. But you've got to remember he's doing this when he's, first of all, one of the very few people in England who is capable of understanding the Tractatus, when he's still 21 years old, and he's setting his course in opposition to the most revered and distinguished philosopher that Cambridge had produced in the early 20th century. Because Russell, who was undoubtedly that before, had, in a sense, kowtowed to Wittgenstein, said Wittgenstein was, as it were, the genius. He, Russell, would learn from Wittgenstein from henceforth. So it's not just setting yourself against the establishment. It's setting yourself on a very, very radical course, and the courage and self-confidence, if you like, to do that at a teenage, late teenage, maybe early 20s, before you've graduated. That's very remarkable. Anyhow, Ramsey did graduate in 1924. He, that's when he was 21. He then devoted himself, I think you could say in equal terms, in equal, proportions, to expanding his private life and expanding his intellectual life. Like many young men at the time, he was hung up about sex, and he decided that he needed psychoanalysis. He was intensely interested in psychology. And so he, the year of his graduation, he took himself off to Vienna. There he met the founding members of the Vienna Circle, which were Maurice Schlick, Rudolf Carnap, Otto Neumann, Otto Neurath, and he undertook a course of psychoanalysis to cure his misunderstandings of himself, or perhaps his misunderstandings about women, or perhaps his misunderstandings about sexual relations. The year in Vienna certainly cured him. Whether it was Theodor Reich, his psychoanalyst, who managed this, or what he himself recounts in a memorandum, a letter to somebody, as a number of rather jolly encounters with a fille de joie, lady of pleasure, prostitute. He came back somewhat cured, or totally cured, of any hang-ups about in that direction. And his private life flourished. He met and fell in love with and married a young woman called Lettice Baker, who was sort of almost a hanger-on of Bloomsbury, part of the same circle, upper middle class, intellectual Cambridge people. And they married, and they produced children. In the manner of Bloomsbury, the marriage was I think they call, with a certain amount of euphemism, open. Both Lettice and Frank Ramsey had affairs on the side, mostly unimportant, some of them important. There was a certain amount of promiscuity around in the Cambridge of the 1920s. But that doesn't really matter. It didn't stop his intellectual trajectory at all. The next thing he did of great intellectual note was to write up his criticism of Keynes, to stop it just being a criticism and start it being the foundation of a new approach to the whole issue of probability, a strength of desire, and the way we behave in the light of our beliefs and desires. Ramsey was intensely interested in psychology, not just psychoanalysis, but he thought that the interpretation of human beings is not just people who behave, but people who think, who plan, who have desires and beliefs in the light of which we approach the world. He thought the science of that was, in a sense, fundamental. And that, again, is a very Peircean idea. It's the way we use language. And it was the way we use the language of probability which Ramsey decided to investigate. And so one of his first great papers, written, I think, if I remember rightly, in 1925, just a year after he graduated, it's called Truth and Probability. And it laid the foundations of what became decision theory, game theory. It became the foundations of Bayesian statistics, which are incredibly important nowadays. And, well, when I say the foundation of Bayesian statistics, Thomas Bayes, writing in the 18th century, was the founder of Bayesian statistics. But Ramsey put this on a different basis. Roughly, Keynes had said that probability was to do with a logical relation between two propositions. So if you take any two propositions, there'd be a certain degree of probability obtaining between them. Now that's a very abstract, sort of almost a mathematician's view of it. And Ramsey says it's just not true. It's simply not true. What happens is we look at some proposition or another, and we take it into our heads and decide whether it affects the extent to which we're going to believe another. That's the psychological reality underlying talk of probability and inference. So, for example, you may be very confident that a particular team is going to win the FA Cup, let's say Manchester United. I may introduce a piece of evidence that the morale in the team is said to be rather iffy these days, then you have to adjust or not. You can decide to ignore my evidence, you can decide it's very important, or you can decide that it's relatively unimportant. That's a subjective or personal reaction to the evidence. And so Ramsey's view of this was that this is, as it were, this is what happens when we talk about probability. Basically, we're all in effect on a race course. We're betting or gambling. We're gambling on the future, and we're facing the future with partial knowledge, partial evidence, a mixture of prejudices, beliefs, and we are to adjust our confidence, the confidence with which we meet the future in the light of that jumble. It could be a jumble, a holistic jumble, as philosophers say. And then there are various rules whereby you should do it. And that's the subject of the logic of decision theory and game theory and so on. So the paper Truth and Probability was absolutely seminal because he showed the degrees of confidence needed to conform to a probability measure. If they didn't conform to that, then you could become the victim of a Dutch book. Now, a Dutch book means you distribute your confidences in such a way that a good bookie could make money out of you, whatever happens. So to give a simple example, suppose there's a 2-horse race and you have a degree of confidence of more than a half that alpha will win, and you have a degree of confidence of more than a half that beta will win, then the clever bookie can take a $10 out of you on the promise that he'll pay you back 10 plus 4, 14 if alpha wins. You say, yeah, that's good because I'm pretty sure alpha's going to win, so 14 is better than 10, I'll take that. And then you turn to beta and he says, yeah, I'll take $10 off you and give you 14 back if, I'll give you 4 more if beta wins. So at the end of the day, you gamble $20 and you get back 8. So you're going to lose whatever happens. I hope I got the maths of that right, but you see the idea. If you're confident that A and you're confident that not A, then somebody who makes you act out those confidences can win off you whatever happens. And that was the foundation of a logic of probability. And Ramsey showed that the logic of that has to conform to the calculus of probabilities. And that gives us a way of thinking about probability, which had hitherto escaped people. People had thought about probability as one thing or another. No theory of it seemed to make perfect sense. And this unified all the different ways in which we attribute probabilities, from card games to coin tossing to horse racing, or to the risks we take and the costs we're prepared to incur as we face the future. So it's a huge, brilliant kind of foundation for the modern theory of decision making. Okay, so that was in 1925. Meanwhile, Ramsey's interest in the human world, as opposed to the world of logic and mathematics, at which he was an extraordinary master, extended to economics. He was a friend of Keynes, as I've already mentioned. There are various other distinguished economists in Cambridge, Arthur Pigou, there was Roy Harrod in Oxford, there was Marshall, the economist in the background in Cambridge. And Ramsey had always been interested in economics, social policy, social welfare. He was part of a very left-wing kind of almost Fabian socialist circles in Cambridge. And he became known to the economists as the go-to person for mathematics. if you wanted to do any calculations, probably everybody in this room knows that economics became extremely mathematical. Well, in those days, it wasn't quite so mathematical. But if you wanted to get the maths right, many of these economists, including Keynes, thought the go-to person was Frank Ramsey. Frank could do the maths, as it were, in his head. So he was was invited into conversations with these people. He thought deeply about economics. And the results, by 1927, he was 3 years into his fellowship, but remember, he's still only 24, was that he wrote 2 papers. One of them was a little bit later, but this is where they started. One was on the theory of taxation. What's the optimal taxation rate? If you tax too much, you suppress economic activity. If you tax too little, you have no state support for things like law, social welfare, the other functions of government. What's the optimal rate of taxation? And the second one was on what's the optimal rate of savings? If we value our own welfare as we do, but we also value our children's welfare and our children's children's welfare, how much are we permitted to exploit the world's resources, and how much are we permitted or required to save to optimize welfare across generations? And he wrote these 2 papers. That was his only published foray into economics, 2 small papers. One became the foundation of taxation theory, an enormous branch of economics. The other one became the foundation of savings theory, the theory of savings. So the mathematical theory of taxation was founded by Ramsey. Mathematical theory of savings was founded by Ramsey. They were both published in a journal that Keynes had been responsible for, called the Economics Journal. And when that journal, in its centenary, published 13 of the most distinguished and important papers in economics it had ever published, it published 13. 2 of them were Ramsey's 2 papers, the only 2 that he ever published in economics. Well, you might think that was enough. So now we have Ramsey taxation theory, we have Ramsey theory and the theory of savings. In formal logic, he wrote a paper called Theories in the last year of his life, in 1929, which also gave his name to something which is very, very important in the philosophy of science, called the Ramsey sentence of a theory. I'll try and say something about that, but not too much because it's quite technical. But just as an aside, he tackled a mathematical problem. This was a couple of years before the great decade of what's become basically the theory of computation. It's kicked off in the early 1930s by Kurt Gödel, but Ramsey was dead by the time Gödel published. But Ramsey was tackling a problem which was absolutely essential to the development of the theory of computation. And this was the question of whether, if you took a formal theory, an axiomatic theory which delivered certain theorems, could you decide by a mechanical method whether such and such a formula would or would not be a theorem of the system? So let's take an example. You've probably all heard of Fermat's last theorem. would there, if you'd had a good enough computer, would it have been able to turn out either that there is a number, such as the a to the n plus b to the n, you can see n to the n and n's go to the 3, or that there's not? Should it have been calculable? Should there have been an algorithm showing it? This is known as the Entscheidungs problem, the decision problem for a formal theory. Now, by the 1930s, there were formal theories capable of axiomatizing arithmetic. And the basis of them was pretty well understood, but the decision problem was very, very difficult and turned out to be, subject to all kinds of wrinkles and problems. And Ramsey tackled it. He didn't solve it. It was solved in the mid-1930s, more or less simultaneously by a logician called Alonzo Church in America and Alan Turing in Cambridge, both with negative answers. They proved that no formal system which is capable of churning out arithmetical theorems can be such that it's subject to a mechanical procedure which tells you whether an arbitrary new sentence is going to be a theorem or not. You just have to try it, and the trial might go on forever. A very famous example of this is Goldbach's conjecture. Goldbach's conjecture says that every even number is the sum of 2 primes. It's very easy to understand. You know what even numbers are. Prime numbers are those that have no divisors except themselves and the number 1. 1, 3, 5, 7, 11, and so on. Is every even number the sum of 2 primes? Nobody knows the answer. It's been tested up to zillions, and every even number so far tested has been the sum of 2 primes. But zillions are only a zillion zillionth of the number of numbers there are. That's infinity. So you could come up with negative results forever and still not know the answer. And there's no known way of computing whether there's an answer or not. Sounds as though there ought to be an answer, you think. My God, the numbers are so determinate. But there's no way of computing it. Well, the theory of what's computable and what's not, the theory of also the consistency of formal systems, took a great leap forward in the decade after Ramsey's death in 1930. But he looked at the Entscheidungs problem, the decision problem, and produced some, as it were, partial results for restricted systems subject to various constraints. In the course of it, he produced a mathematical result, which is also named after him. So you've got his name on 2 results in economics, now his name on a piece of pure mathematics, combinatorial mathematics as it's called, which is Ramsey theory. Ramsey theory is the theory of the extent to which order is bound to exist in arbitrary sets. It's often introduced by means of the party problem. If you have 6 people in a party, how many people either know one another or do not know one another? And the answer turns out to be 3. I'll leave you to work it out. So there's, what's the least number of people, I should have said, who know one another, or least number of people who don't know one another? The answer is 3. Combinatorics now has a whole branch called Ramsey theory because of the result he got in that paper. Also in 1929, the last year of his life, he wrote a little paper called Theories, which I'm not going to describe to you, although I've written extensively about it. It introduced the idea of the Ramsey sentence of a theory, which is a sentence which, in a sense, distilled out the logic of a theory, leaving it open what were the things that satisfied the logics, the inferential structures of a theory. So it became the foundation of what's sometimes called structural realism in the philosophy of science, which says that science does describe the underlying realities of the world, the electrons, the forces, the fields, the superpositions, the quantum phenomena, and so on. But all we can know about them is their structure. We can't know what they are in themselves. And this is sometimes called Ramseyan humility. But the sentence which distills this structure is called the Ramsey sentence of a theory. And for the next, well, it's now 90 years since Ramsey's death, and it's still the centerpiece of a great deal of the philosophy of science. So we have his name on two seminal contributions to economics, Ramsey sentences to the philosophy of science, Ramsey humility to the philosophy of science, and a huge legacy of papers. Well, it's not a very huge legacy of papers. It's a very fine legacy of papers. It's the best collection is, can I show you this? I don't know if you can see that. That's the man. I should have described him a bit more. He was a genial giant who was universally loved. As you can see his big, smiling, round face. Apparently a huge laugh. The absolute opposite of Wittgenstein. If you think of Wittgenstein as the sort of tortured, fierce, difficult genius, Ramsey was full of bonhomie. He was genial. He was universally loved. And it was only when he started thinking and talking that you realized you were in the presence of something utterly remarkable. Well, I thought I'd finish, if I may. Have I got any time left? I seem to have been whittling on for ages. Don, am I out of time?
No, it's very much in your control.
Sorry?
Very much in your control. We don't stipulate too strongly.
Well, I thought I'd like to give you a sense of his personality, which I think is extraordinarily visible in a little essay he wrote. Obviously, as you know, such a premier intellectual, he was invited to all the intellectual clubs in Cambridge. And the most famous one was the Conversazione Society, sometimes known as the Apostles, which a lot of Bloomsbury people belonged to, Leonard Woolf, Maynard Keynes, so on. And he wrote a paper for them in 1925. This was the year after he graduated. He's still very young, of course. And I think I'll just read it to you. It's about 3 pages. But I think it gives you a sense of the man himself, l'homme même. Having to write a paper for the Society, I was, as usual, at the loss for a subject. And I flattered myself that this was not merely my personal deficiency, but arose from the fact that there really was no subject suitable for discussion. But, happening to have recently lectured on the theory of types, that was his contribution to Russell's logic, I reflected that in such a sentence, the word subject must be limited to mean subject of the first order, and that perhaps there might be a subject of the second order, which would be possible. And then I saw that it lay ready before me, namely, that I should put forward the thesis that there is a thesis which is about first order topics, namely that there aren't any of them, is a second order thesis. That's the theory of types, first and second orders of things. A serious matter, this, if it is true, for what does this society exist for but discussion? And if there is nothing to discuss, well, that can be left until afterwards. I do not wish to maintain that there's never been anything to discuss, but only that there is no longer. We have really settled everything by realizing that there is nothing to know except science, and that we are most ignorant of, and that we are most of us ignorant of most sciences, so that while we can exchange information, we cannot usefully discuss it, as we are just learners. Well, let us review the possible objects of discussion. They fall, as far as I can see, under the heads of science, philosophy, history, politics, psychology, and aesthetics. Where not to beg any questions, I am separating psychology from the other sciences. Science, history, and politics are not suited for discussion except by experts. Others are simply in the position of requiring more information. Until they have acquired all available information, cannot do anything but accept on authority the opinions of those better qualified. Then there is philosophy. This too has become too technical for the layman. It had in his day, and it remains so too. Besides this disadvantage, the conclusion of the greatest modern philosopher, that's Wittgenstein, is that there is no such subject as philosophy, that it is an activity, not a doctrine, and that instead of answering questions, it aims merely at curing headaches. Wittgenstein thought of philosophy as a kind of therapy. It aims merely at curing headaches. It might be thought that, apart from this technical philosophy, whose centre is logic, there was a sort of popular philosophy which dealt with such subjects as the relations of man to nature and the meaning of morality. But any attempt to treat such topics seriously reduces them to questions either of science or of technical philosophy, or results more immediately in perceiving them to be nonsense. Take as an example, here the light tone slightly hardens, Russell's recent lecture on What I Believe. He divides it into two parts, the philosophy of nature and the philosophy of value. His philosophy of nature consisted mainly in the conclusions of modern physics, physiology and astronomy, with a slight admixture of his own theory of material objects as a particular kind of logical construction. Its content could therefore only be discussed by someone with an adequate knowledge of relativity, atomic theory, physiology, and mathematical logic. The only remaining possibility of discussion is in connection with this part of his paper, would be about the emphasis he laid on certain points, for instance, the disparity in physical size between stars and men. To this topic, I shall return. His philosophy of value consists in saying that the only questions about values were what men desired and how those desires could be satisfied. And then he went on to answer these questions. Thus, the whole subject became part of psychology, and its discussion would be a psychological one. Of course, his main statement about value might be disputed, but most of us would agree that the objectivity of good was a thing that had been settled and discussed with the existence of God. Theology and absolute ethics are two famous subjects, which we have realized to have no real subjects. Ethics has been reduced to psychology, and that brings me to psychology as a subject for discussion. Most of our meetings might be said to deal with psychological questions. It is a subject in which we are all more or less interested for practical reasons. In considering it, we must distinguish psychology proper, which is the study of mental events with a view to establishing scientific generalizations, from merely comparing our own experience from personal interest. The test is whether we should want to know of this experience as much if it were as strangers as we do when it is our own or our friends, whether we are interested in it as a scientific material or as merely from personal curiosity. I think we rarely, if ever, discuss fundamental psychological questions, but far more often simply compare our several experiences, which is not a form of discussing. I think we realize too little how often our arguments are of this form. A, I went to Grantchester this afternoon. B, I didn't. Another thing we often do is to discuss what sort of people or behavior we feel admiration for or ashamed of. E.g., when we discuss constancy of affection, it consists in A, saying he would feel guilty if he wasn't constant, B, saying he wouldn't feel guilty in the least. But that, although a pleasant way of passing the time, is not discussing anything whatever. It is simply comparing notes. Genuine psychology, on the other hand, is a science of which most of us know far too little for it to become us to venture an opinion. Lastly, there's aesthetics, including literature. This always excites us far more than anything else, but we don't really discuss it much. Our arguments are so feeble. We are still at the stage of who drives up fat oxen must himself be fat, and have very little to say about the psychological problems of which aesthetics really consists, e.g. why some certain combinations of colours give us such peculiar feelings. What we really like doing is again to compare our experience, a practice which in this case is peculiarly profitable because the critic can point out things to other people to which, if they attend, they will obtain feelings which they value, which they failed to obtain otherwise. We do not seek and cannot discuss whether our one work of art is better than another. We merely compare the feelings it gives us. I conclude that there's really nothing to discuss, and this conclusion corresponds to a feeling I have about ordinary conversations also. One is the advance of science, and the other is the decay of religion, which have resulted in us all the old general questions becoming either technical or ridiculous. This process is the development of civilization. We have each of us to repeat in ourselves. I, for instance, came up as a freshman enjoying conversation and argument more than anything else in the world. But I have gradually come to be regarded as of less and less importance because there never seems to be anything to talk about, except shop and people's private lives, neither of which is suitable for general conversation. Also, since I was analysed, I feel that people know far less about themselves than they imagine, and are not nearly so anxious to talk about, and I am not nearly so anxious to talk about myself as I used to be, having had enough of it to get bored. There still are literature and art, but about those one cannot argue. One can only compare notes. This brings me back to Russell and what I believe. If I was to write a Weltanschauung, I should not call it what I believe, but what I feel. This is connected with Wittgenstein's view that philosophy does not give us beliefs, but merely relieves feelings of discomfort. Also, if I were to quarrel with Russell's lecture, it would not be with what he believed, but what his inclinations he gave to us as to what he felt. Where I seem to differ, and this is a very famous paragraph from Ramsey, where I seem to differ from some of my friends is in attaching little importance to physical size. I don't feel the least humble before the vastness of the heavens. The stars may be large. They cannot think or love. And these are qualities which impress me far more than size does. I take no credit for weighing nearly 17 stones. My picture of the world is drawn in perspective and not like a model to scale. The foreground is occupied by human beings, and the stars are all as small as threepenny bits. I don't really believe in astronomy except as a complicated description of part of the course of human and possibly animal sensation. I apply my perspective not merely to space but also to time. In time, the world will cool and everything will die. But that is a long time off still, and its present value at compound discount is almost nothing. Nor is the present less valuable because the future will be blank. Humanity, which fills the foreground of my picture, I find interesting and on the whole admirable. I find just now, at least, the world a pleasant and exciting place. You may find it depressing. I'm sorry for you and you despise me. But I have reason and you have none. You would only have a reason for despising me if your feeling corresponded to the facts in a way that mine doesn't. But neither can correspond to the facts. The fact is not in itself good or bad. It is just that it thrills me but depresses you. On the other hand, I pity you with reason because it is pleasanter to be thrilled than to be depressed, and not merely pleasanter, but better for all one's activities. That was a kind of credo from Ramsey, written, very few years before he died. And I'd like to leave it with you. I strongly recommend you to find his writings. They're not easy. That's the easiest of them, probably. They're all in this volume. But if you can read the Cheryl Mishak book about his life and work, I think you'd have a real treat. I think all of you would just be delighted at that. It's a wonderful book. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Simon. I think you should consider yourself to have a virtual round of applause at this point. But we should perhaps go on to offer people the chance of discussion and questions. And can I pass the thing to Andreas at this point?
That's great. Thank you very much, Simon, for an excellent talk on Frank Ramsey, the unknown genius of Cambridge. I think you've enlightened many of us to a polymath in economics, in mathematics, in logic, in philosophy, and also involved in psychology. I mean, it's you don't get many people like this anymore. That's for sure. So now we're coming to the Q&A session. We've got 25 minutes for that. And you can ask questions in one of three ways. We've got some questions already in the chat room, which I can read out, or I can ask people who ask them to unmute themselves and ask them themselves. So either that. The second way is in the old-fashioned way of showing a video and raising your hand. And in the third way, there is a function in Zoom, which you may have discovered, little three dots on the right-hand side under chat and under participants, where you can raise your hand electronically. A little blue symbol comes up. So you've got different ways of doing it. Now, Joanna, you were the first person with a question. So do you want me to read it out or do you want to ask it yourself?
Oh, I would love the honor of asking a question. I'm a huge fan. And I loved the real content of your talk, but I have a question that I'm actually sincerely interested in, although it was almost a by the way. You were describing about the coming of understanding about Peirce, and you said something about how there used to be intellectual magazines, then there aren't anymore. And you also said something about how Ramsey was barely on top of the logic of the time. That was incredibly complicated, but that contemporary logics are more complicated. And so I'm just sort of fascinated by these little glimpses into the shift of what it meant to be an intellectual in the last century. So can you address these?
Wow, well, it's a big topic, as you know, because the different trajectories that intellectual life took are very complex. At the end of the 19th century, you had the development of what's sometimes called continental philosophy, although that's a slightly ridiculous term, but the world of Nietzsche, which developed into the world of people like Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Sartre, the existentialists, and then modern French sort of postmodernists. That was one trajectory intellectual life took, philosophical life. Another one was the world of Cambridge, which was very austere logic, Wittgenstein, Ramsey. And of course, we have to remember that out of that came the modern world. Out of that came computation, computation theory. One of Ramsey's great friends, I didn't mention this, but it's all detailed in Cheryl's book, a contemporary mathematician at Cambridge was a man called Max Newman. And Max Newman taught Alan Turing. He was a code breaker in the famous Bletchley in the Second World War. And he was basically the guiding genius behind the first ever digital computer at the University of Manchester, directly after the Second World War. So there was a huge ferment of computation theory, of the understanding of what formal systems and machines implementing formal systems could actually do, which, you know, took off in those years. It had been sort of heralded in a way, famously by Ada Lovelace and Charles Babbage in the 19th century. But of course, until the electronic computer came along, computing machines were sort of on a par with, musical clocks and things. They were just clockwork, as it were. But suddenly they took off, and of course, in the last 100 years, they've taken off unbelievably. 80 years. Yes, I mean, the general trajectories of intellectual life are, I think, at a slightly low point at present. It's even in my own lifetime, sort of highbrow magazines have disappeared, or more or less disappeared. I remember reading The Listener as an undergraduate with great enthusiasm for bits of culture I knew nothing about. I'm not sure what I could read these days. But of course, we've got other sources. You can find out anything on Wikipedia. You can, follow up anything on YouTube, practically. So, it's difficult to compute the swings of the swings and roundabouts, the ups and downs.
Absolutely. There's certainly a plethora of YouTube videos and podcasts on philosophy.
I know, I've contributed to some of them.
Yeah. Yes, I know. I listened to the series in Our Time with Melvin Bragg, and I think you several times, Simon.
That's a good program, actually. He's very good.
Yeah, good. Thank you for that. Just to everybody, not many people are showing the video just yet, so feel free in the Q&A session to show your video and then ask questions that way. Feel free to unmute yourself as well. The more the merrier. And I've got another question in chat, but before we go to chat, maybe I go to, I still can't remember your name.
It's Duncan.
Duncan, I've heard you so many times. I only know him as iPad. Duncan, over to you.
I might be changing my name to iPad to remove any confusion. You described Ramsey's criticism of the Tractatus, and it sounded a bit like the sort of criticism that the later Wittgenstein made of the Tractatus. What was Wittgenstein, do you think, influenced by Ramsey? Had his mind changed?
I can quote this from the preface to that Tractatus. Hang on, I've got it here in a text. Ramsey said about the Tractatus, this is a quote from Ramsey, "We cannot really picture the world as disconnected selves, the cells we know are in the world. What we can't do, and it is no good trying. Philosophy comes from not understanding the logic of our language. The logic of our language is not what Wittgenstein thought. The pictures we make to ourselves are not pictures of facts. In the Tractatus, the fundamental kind of relationship between language and the world was that
Pictures.
Sentences were pictures of facts. Ramsey says, no, that's not right. And then Wittgenstein wrote in 1945 in the preface to the Philosophical Investigations, which is, of course, the sort of primary text for the later Wittgenstein. I was helped to realize these mistakes in the Tractatus, to a degree which I myself am hardly able to estimate, by the criticism which my ideas encountered from Frank Ramsey, with whom I discussed them on innumerable occasions in the last 2 years of his life. And that's a very generous, in a sense, recantation on Wittgenstein's part, because when Ramsey died, Wittgenstein went into a kind of hissy fit and said, oh, he had a bourgeois mind, I never learned anything from him, he was, he didn't understand me, and so on. He was playing the prima donna. But with time, Wittgenstein came to recognize that he owed the enormous change in the direction of his philosophy, from the very austere world of the Tractatus to the later Wittgenstein, which is there in the Philosophical Investigations, where meaning is use. You have to look for the meaning of language and the use of language, and you look for that in the activities of the people who use the language. And I think Ramsey gave them that orientation.
Very good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Very good. And we've got another very similar question between the relationship between Ramsey and Wittgenstein from another Duncan McGibbon. Duncan, do you want to ask the question yourself, or do you want me to read it out from chat? If you unmute yourself, Duncan, then maybe you can just tell me.
Trying to unmute.
Pardon?
Am I unmute yet?
Yes.
Yeah, first of all, Simon, thank you ever so much for that really beautiful talk. I really, you brought Ramsey alive, and I love that. But I'd like to ask about the problem of catching Wittgenstein's cab to carry Ramsey, and catching Ramsey's cab to carry Wittgenstein. The problem always is that if you happen to like Wittgenstein a lot, you tend to neglect Ramsey. And if you like Ramsey a lot, you tend to neglect Wittgenstein. And the problem really lies in not disparaging either. I do think, maybe accidentally, without the slightest intention, you have slightly disparaged Wittgenstein in character. I mean, it needs to be pointed out that Wittgenstein did not, in fact, come from an academically privileged background in the way that Ramsey did. His father was, after all, a mathematician and also, I think, a fellow of Magdalen College. Yeah. Whereas, of course, his father was a businessman, and Wittgenstein's only undergraduate work was actually in a technological college designing a helicopter. So it was the Tractatus that brought that brought philosophy's attention to him. So one of the most important things I'm interested in is what's the basic difference between the two philosophers. I think they disagreed over ontology and identity, right? Ramsey always taking a pragmatic view of both, whereas Wittgenstein regarded both in Ramsey's formulation as meaningless. For example, in the statement, Socrates is wise and wisdom is a characteristic of Socrates. So statement one is Socrates is wise. Statement two is wisdom is a characteristic of Socrates, right? Ramsey would regard them as being identical in meaning. Yeah. Whereas followers of Wittgenstein, such as Elizabeth Anscombe and Peter Geach, made it absolutely clear that whereas you can negate a predicate, right, a characteristic, you know, right? So a predicate, you can't negate a name such as Socrates. And therefore, in terms of logic, right, you can't say that they both mean the same thing. What do you think?
Okay. First of all, let me backtrack a moment. You're absolutely right about the, as it were, the slant I probably gave to this. I did not mean to denigrate Wittgenstein as a philosopher. I think he's a great philosopher. There's no question of it. One of the amazing things about Wittgenstein is you almost can't, you certainly can't pick up a book of his. I mean, the Tractatus or the Investigations, or even the notes put together by his students, like the Bloom-Brown books, or the notes compiled by Elizabeth Anscombe in his, Zettel and so on. You can't pick them up without having this sort of shiver of recognition that there's something very important going on here. You may not know what it is, but you know that whatever it is, it could occupy you for a long time. It's that aphoristic, almost Nietzschean style of writing which Wittgenstein had, which is absolutely wonderful, I think. I'd actually say he's a better stylist, a better philosophical writer than Nietzsche, and that's saying something. However, I think as a personality, Wittgenstein was, in many respects, a great deal less attractive than Ramsey. Ramsey was genial, he was friendly, he famously laughed a lot, he was congenial. He hadn't an ounce of pride or an ounce of, noli me tangere. Whereas Wittgenstein was almost entirely noli me tangere. Wittgenstein was the reverse of a Democrat. Wittgenstein thought nobody would understand him. His thought was beyond not just the common herd, but everybody else. And that kind of, Christ-like almost separation of himself from the rest of humanity, I find deeply unattractive. Ramsey, by contrast, is a genial spirit. He played games. He loved mountain climbing, walking, swimming, the whole thing. He married, he had sexual affairs. He was a human being through and through, and that I'd find very much more attractive. But as a philosopher, you're absolutely right. I mean, although Ramsey was clearly a far better mathematician, far better economist, Wittgenstein had no pretenses as either a mathematician or an economist. Wittgenstein was an engineer and was pretty good at it. But as a philosopher, I think it's pretty even going. I mean, certainly Wittgenstein impressed people. Wittgenstein had charisma in a way that Ramsey didn't. If you're an ordinary human being, you don't have charisma. You've got to set yourself up as a saint or guru or a seer, as a messiah almost. And Wittgenstein could do that. And people took him at face value. I mean, when I went up to Cambridge, Wittgenstein's ghost, this was in 1962, and he died 10 years before. But Wittgenstein's ghost was everywhere. There were people who imitated him. You pointed out places where he lived or whatever. And, it was a while before, as a student, I learned to appreciate Ramsey. So there's no question that as far as the business of creating apostles and disciples goes, Wittgenstein was head and shoulders above Ramsey. As a philosopher, I'm not so sure.
Well, thank you very much for that, Simon. That's very interesting. We've got another question in the chat room from A. Paul. do you want to ask the question yourself, or do you want me to read it out? Question from A. Paul.
Hello?
Hello there.
Hello?
Hello.
Hi.
Would you like to ask your questions, Paul?
Well, I mean, I think it is as I've written it, really, insofar as I'm interested in the status of everyday talk, the talk of non-specialists about things. I mean, we're all constantly nowadays talking about coronavirus and T cells and so on. And yet, if you were to ask me about, in detail, about any of the things that I talk about, you'll find that my knowledge is very superficial indeed. And so I question how much of this I actually know. You know, what is the status of what I know? And that applies not just to coronavirus, but enormous range of stuff, really. You know, people buy books about cosmology, and, you know, we read them. I could memorize bits of them. My knowledge of it is actually pretty tenuous. Now, I have no idea if this is actually related to what you said, but when you spoke about the Ramsey sentences, it did seem to apply in some way.
Yes, well, another phrase that's gone into the lexicon is Ramseyan humility. And Ramseyan humility is the understanding, and this is partly a Kantian idea, actually, that while we often know what things do, we don't have a very secure grasp of what they are. That is, you know, especially in, say, science, we know about, I don't know, say, spin in the subatomic particles. We know how to measure an effect that these things have, but measuring an effect of something and knowing what it is that has the effect seem to be two different things. I can know, for example, that eating such and such a berry makes me feel ill, but I don't know why. I don't know what it is about it that did that. I just know the causal relation, the causal effect. If you just know the effect of things, it might seem as though you can't know what they are. Now, often, of course, there's also a phenomenon in philosopher's language sometimes called the division of labor. That is, the scientist labors away to find out quite a lot about, you know, coronavirus or whatever it is. The rest of us pick up the language and we talk about coronaviruses, and then what we say is, as it were, created by the labor of the scientist. So in a sense, we don't know what we're saying. We don't know what we're talking about. And that's Ramseyan humility, that we often, as we talk, we don't know what we're talking about. And it's a problem. I don't think it's a superable problem. I think it's part of the human condition. And we have to recognize it. It's part of self-understanding and understanding our relationships with each other, that an awful lot of the time when we feel we're in control of our language, it's actually our language and the authorities behind our language, the authorities who say what coronavirus is or what T cells are, who are determining what we mean by what we say. So there's a very strong sense in which we don't know what we mean by what we say. And that's a very humiliating thought.
Thank you. That answers my question very exactly. Are there certain key papers that I should read if I wanted to study those that further?
I'm terribly bad at bibliographies. My elderly memory forgets.
I could email you and ask.
You could email me, please. Yes, do. I mean, I'll try and answer it. There's certainly a paper by Hilary Putnam on this, which was quite seminal. I can't remember what he called it.
Maybe the meaning of meaning.
Yes, it could have been. Who said that?
It's me, Andreas.
Yes, well done, Andreas. I think that's probably it.
Yes, the meaning of meaning. That's
yeah, look up, Google Hilary Putnam, the meaning of meaning, and it should come up.
Good. Well, thank you for that answer, Simon. It's coming up to the watershed. We've got a question, one more question, and Mike has raised his hand first. So, Mike, you have the privilege of asking the last question of tonight.
Well, great privilege. I want to thank you, if I may, twice over. Once, as Duncan did, for a really entertaining and insightful talk. But actually, even before the talk, the fact that you raised this name and sort of hinted at what an interesting character he was. And I must confess, I preempted the talk and started to sort of dig in a little bit. And I do find him very interesting. I find him interesting in that he particularly was interested, you say, in Peirce, which no one else really in England seemed to be very interested in at that time. And coming back, and also his rather witty sort of tongue-in-cheek way of saying very clever things. And I'd like to come in the questions, ask about the little extract you read at the end. I wonder whether beneath all that, there wasn't a feeling, or he was trying to say, well, the time has passed for general discussion, sort of Socrates-type dialogue. Everything now is technical. What needs to be said can be said in succinct, technical ways, and really discussion has almost become irrelevant.
Yes, well, that was the message, of course, of his. I mean, you know, if as a teacher of philosophy, if an undergraduate student had presented that piece to me, I'd have worried about its, in a sense, its positivism, its sense that the only questions that remain are scientific questions. Because I don't think that when we discuss aesthetics or ethics, we are simply confined to comparing feelings. I think we are also, as Ramsey himself said elsewhere, we're also trying to persuade people into, and this is his phrase, the system with which we meet the future. So, for example, if I tell you that populist politics is a bad thing, you can indeed just take away from that Simon Blackburn thinks that populist politics are a bad thing. You know how I feel about it. But of course, the burden of my saying wasn't just to tell you that's how I feel about it. It was to, as it were, cajole you into thinking this is the way to think about the future. Populist politics is going to be and is a bad thing. You better believe it. Now, it may be no more than persuasion, but it is persuasion, and it's a very important part of the way we talk to each other. I want you to share my view. And of course, if you don't share my view, you could say sort of snittily, "Oh, that's just your opinion." But that's not really a move in the conversation. The conversation is about whether populist politics is a good thing with which to meet the future. And if I think it is and you think it's not, then we disagree. Then we have to try to adduce reasons and arguments and so on. So I think Ramsey was actually a little bit austere at that point about what he regarded as worth discussing. Because I think it's eminently worth discussing whether populist politics is a good way to meet the future. And I think that's worth discussing because I fear that if people veer the wrong way on that, then the future will be much worse than it would otherwise be.
Good, thank you very much. Well, nevertheless, we shall meet the future of politics within a few weeks' time, and we can make up our mind as to whether that's a good or bad thing. Well, listen, Simon, thank you so much for a very erudite, very interesting and enlightening talk about an unknown philosopher to most of us, probably, Frank Ramsey. And I think it's probably changed our view of a lot of philosophy as a result of that. So thank you very much, and a big round of applause.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for listening, and thank you for your questions. I love talking about this sort of thing.
But that's very much appreciated. I mean, just to finish off to all of you in the group, is next month we've got a lecture by a BLSI member, Jeremy Comerford, on the philosophy of Locke, the British empiricist. That should be quite interesting. And then in December, we've got Professor A.C. Grayling coming back and giving a talk on the history of philosophy. So that should be quite interesting. And if his book is anything to go by, he may even stray into some Eastern philosophy and not just contain himself within Western philosophy. So we shall see. Well, listen, it's been a very interesting evening, everybody. I hope you all enjoyed it. And as they say nowadays, stay healthy, stay safe, and most of all, stay sane. All the very best.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you, Don.
Thank you. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, thanks.